How's it going, everyone? Today we're going to get into the aquatic biomes. So, last lecture we talked about the terrestrial biomes. Now we'll talk about the aquatic biomes. Like terrestrial biomes, aquatic biomes are influenced by abiotic factors. So, the abiotic factors that will eventually influence the biotic factors. The first abiotic factor is light. So, as you descend deeper and deeper into a body of water, eventually you're going to get to a point where you'll be at a depth at which the sunlight cannot reach, either because there's going to be particles suspended within the water or the water itself will absorb the light. While there are some abiotic and biotic factors in a terrestrial ecosystem that will shade light, like trees or fog, dust, or maybe even insect swarms, these are not usually permanent features of the environment, right? Those things will usually go away at some point. Um, but within this aquatic biome, you get actual stratification of light that lasts throughout the entirety of an organism's life cycle. Um, the amount of light that can reach certain aquatic biomes is the central factor that'll determine what communities of organisms can be found in them. So, in addition to light, the solar radiation from the sun will warm bodies of water, and what you'll see is that you won't see just layering of light, but you'll see layers of differing temperatures as well. The water temperature affects the organism's rate of growth, the amount of dissolved oxygen available for them to breathe, and so temperature is a second abiotic factor that affects organisms within aquatic biomes. The movement of water or the flow regime is also important to many aquatic biomes. So, for example, in rivers, the organisms must be adapted to this constant movement of water around them. But even in the larger bodies of water, such as the oceans, they have regular currents and tides that impact the availability of nutrients, food resources, and even the presence of water itself. Finally, the last one that I'll talk about is dissolved solids. Water contains dissolved solids like salts, for example. Even fresh water contains low levels of such dissolved substances because the water is rapidly recycled through evaporation and precipitation. Um, the oceans have a relatively constant high salt content, right? We know that when you get into the ocean, if you've ever been to the ocean, the water is extremely salty. You'll even find aquatic habitats that are at the interface or where the mixing of marine and freshwater ecosystems. And there's going to have this complex and variable salt environments that range between extreme fresh and extreme salt levels. These are known as brackish water environments. Um, and you'll find lakes that might be located close to drainage basins have really high salt concentrations in their waters. And sometimes you'll get lakes that have such extremely high salt content that they're even more salty than you'd find in the ocean, and that would result in only a few highly specialized species able to inhabit there. So, with that, let's get into our first biome, which is the oceans. You might know that the oceans cover 71% of the Earth's surface, and really they contain 97% of the Earth's water. Some more facts here. Less than 1% of the Earth's water is fresh water, and 2 to 3% of that is contained in glaciers and ice caps that are inaccessible. The oceans contain 99% of the living space on the planet. Um, so let's take a look at this little image here. And the ocean is categorized by several zones. All of the ocean's open water is known as the pelagic zone or the pelagic realm. So here's all of the open water in the ocean, known as the pelagic realm. But within that, there are different zones. There's the benthic zone that extends along the ocean bottom, um, and from the shoreline to the deepest parts of the ocean. So the very bottom is called the benthic zone or the benthic realm. From the surface to the limit to which photosynthesis can occur is called the photic zone. Well, basically just how far light can penetrate. Once that light can't penetrate anymore, it enters the aphotic zone. The majority of the ocean, in fact, is aphotic, which means that there's just not enough light for photosynthesis to occur. Um, the deepest part of the ocean, which is the Challenger Deep, which is located in the Mariana Trench, which is found in the western Pacific Ocean, it's about 6.8 miles deep, or 11,000 meters. just to give some perspective on that depth, the ocean is on average only 14,000 feet deep. So this is like 3 times as deep as the average depth of the ocean is the Mariana Trench. Just a cool little fact there. But each of these zones has a distinct group of species that will be adapted to the biotic and abiotic conditions particular to that zone. So let's talk about the first one, the intertidal zone. So if you go back here, you take a look back. This intertidal zone is this very beginning of this ocean, of the ocean. So the intertidal zone is the oceanic region that is closest to land. With each tidal cycle, so high tide and low tide, the intertidal zone will alternate between being inundated with water and being left high and dry. Generally, most people will think of this portion of the ocean as the sandy beach, but in some cases, that's definitely true. Like if you go down to Florida, there are sandy beaches, but it can also be a rocky beach, a muddy beach, or it can be dense and tangled with roots of a mangrove forest. And basically, they all are the same thing, the intertidal zone. It's an extremely variable environment because of the tides. Organisms might be exposed to air at low tide for a number of hours, and they'll be underwater during high tide for a whole bunch of other hours. Therefore, the living things that live there have to be adapted to being dry and wet for periods of time. The shore of the intertidal zone is also repeatedly struck by waves when we're talking about the ocean, and the organisms found there have to adapt to withstand damage from the pounding action of the waves. What you'll see is that these organisms will often have exoskeletons, like these shoreline crustaceans you see here, that are tough and that will protect them from desiccation, which is drying out, and the wave damage. Another consequence of the pounding waves is that really we'll see few algae or plants that are able to establish themselves because the wave action will just be too much for their roots to take hold. Let's look at the next zone, the Neritic Zone. So it's a little farther out from the intertidal zone. We're going to be moving away from the shore into deeper water here, the Neritic Zone. The Neritic Zone extends from the margin of the intertidal zone to depths of about 650 feet, or like 200 meters. It's going to be at the edge of the continental shelf itself, so basically the edge of where land stops. When the water is relatively clear, photosynthesis can occur here, so we can have photosynthetic organisms living in the Neritic Zone. The water will contain silt, which is just very fine sediment particles, and it'll be well oxygenated. It'll have low pressure, and it'll be stable in temperature. So the sunlight can reach all the way through, and so that means the entirety of this water column in the Neritic Zone will have a stable temperature. All those factors will contribute to the Neritic Zone having the highest productivity and the highest biodiversity of the ocean. You'll have phytoplankton, which are just planktonic species that can do photosynthesis and photosynthetic bacteria, and you'll have larger species of algae. Those are all going to be responsible for the bulk of this primary productivity due to photosynthesis. You also have zooplankton, which are just plankton that don't do photosynthesis, that instead are eutrophic. You'll have protists, you'll have the small fish that feed on them, and shrimp that will feed on the producers that we just talked about. Those are going to be the primary food sources for most of the world's fisheries, and the majority of these fisheries will exist in the Neritic Zone. All right. So beyond the Neritic Zone, we've got the Oceanic Zone. Within the Oceanic Zone, there is a thermal stratification, and what that means is that as you go deeper and deeper, the water becomes colder and colder. You'll have a bunch of phytoplankton near the top and zooplankton that'll support the populations of fish and whales and other organisms. And nutrients are going to be scarce, but because of all the phytoplankton that are taking up the nutrients. When photosynthetic organisms and organisms that feed on them die, what happens is that their bodies fall to the bottom of the ocean. And there's really no way for that nutrient that's going to be trapped in the dead bodies to get back up here. And so in the Oceanic Zone, there's going to be very low nutrients here. Okay. So once we've got through all of the water column, when we talked about the pelagic zone or the pelagic realm, we get the benthic zone. This the deep water region beyond the continental shelf. The bottom of this benthic zone, it's going to be comprised of sand, silt, dead organisms. It's going to be very cold here because really very little to any sunlight is going to reach down to this point. It's going to be nutrient rich because of all the dead organisms that fall from the upper layers of the ocean. And because of this, because of that high level of nutrients, you're going to get a diversity of fungi, sponges, sea anemones, worms, sea stars, fishes, and bacteria that can exist. Here's just an example of a deep water set of organisms that all are living down here. Now, these guys live in almost total darkness, so this has been taken by some sort of submersible machine that can take pictures, but you can see we've got a lot of life living really, really, really deep in the ocean. Um, the deepest part of the ocean is called the Abyssal Zone. Uh, this is depths of 4,000 meters or greater. The Abyssal Zone is very, very cold and has very, very high pressure, where you could not be down here and survive. The pressure itself would kill you. It's going to have extremely high oxygen content and low nutrient content. There's going to be a variety of invertebrates and fishes that are found in this zone, but the Abyssal Zone does not have photosynthetic organisms. Instead, you'll find chemosynthetic bacteria, and that's just organisms that can use chemicals within their environment to produce the material they need to survive. And they will get hydrogen sulfide and other minerals that are going to be emitted from deep hydrothermal vents. Remember when we talked about how life originated on this earth? One theory is that the life originated from these hydrothermal vents themselves. Um, so you'll find bacteria that can use hydrogen sulfide as an energy source, and they serve as the base of the food chain that are going to be found around these vents. So that's the oceans. Let's talk about another biome you'll find within the oceans, but these are the coral reefs. So coral reefs are going to be formed by these marine invertebrates living in warm, shallow waters within the photic zone of the ocean. So these are absolutely dependent on sunlight. You can see here this image of the sunlight reaching down to these corals. You're going to find them within 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south of the equator. So a very small, pretty small range of where you can find coral reefs because they're so dependent on this sunlight. You'll find coral reefs that are circular reefs that are surrounding former islands that are now underwater. And we'll talk about how coral reefs form on the next slide, but what we learned about cnidarians in the past is that the coral forming colonies secrete this calcium carbonate skeleton, and these calcium carbonate skeletons slowly accumulate over time, which forms the reef. So they produce calcium carbonate, then they die, but that calcium carbonate stays and can be the substrate in which new coral is built on top of. And so over millions of years, you get accumulation of this calcium carbonate that builds up this reef. The corals that we find in these shallow waters that are no more than about 200 feet deep have this mutualistic relationship with this photosynthetic unicellular protist called zooxanthellae. This relationship provides the corals with the majority of the nutrition and the energy they require. What you'll see is that the water here is very, very clear, which means that there's not a lot of nutrient within the water, and that's absolutely necessary for the sunlight to reach down. So without the photosynthetic algae that they have this mutualistic relationship with, it would be impossible for these large corals to grow because there's really no other way for them to get food like from from planktonic organisms. There's really no plankton that are going to be within the water column. Coral reefs are one of the most diverse biomes. It's estimated that there's more than 4,000 fish species that can inhabit coral reefs. These fishes can feed on coral or the cryptofauna, which are just the invertebrates that you'll find hiding within coral, or the seaweed and the algae that is associated with the coral. So they really become these really, really diverse biomes that are unfortunately under some really bad stress from human impacts of climate change. And so I'm sure you've all heard about coral bleaching and things along that line. We're not going to get into that here just yet, but it's a really important biome that is under a lot of stress right now. Here's 3 stages of coral reef formation, and basically what happens is that you get some sort of volcanic island that emerges and then over time cools and sinks down into the ocean. What is left is the reef that is on the outside. So when the volcanic island is at its peak, you get what is called a fringing reef. As it starts to sink, you get something that's called a barrier reef, where there's a little bit of water between the reef and the island, and then at some point the island will submerge completely, leaving this ring of the reef, and they call that an atoll at that point. So just three different stages of a reef. Okay, let's talk about where the ocean meets freshwater. You call these estuaries, and estuaries are biomes that occur where a river, a source of fresh water, meets the ocean. Therefore, both freshwater and saltwater are found in the same vicinity. And it gets this mixed result, which is this diluted, what they call brackish water, which is just a mix of salt and fresh water. Estuaries form these protected areas where you'll get a lot of the offspring of crustaceans, mollusks, and fish beginning their lives. Salinity is going to be an important factor that's going to influence the organisms and the adaptation of the organisms found in estuaries. The salinity or salt concentration of estuaries varies, and it's based on the rate of flow of its freshwater sources. Right? Once or twice a day, you get high tides that bring salt water into the estuary, and you get low tides that are occurring at the same frequency that will reverse the content of salt water. So this daily mixing of fresh water and salt water is a physiological challenge that the plants and animals that live there have to face. Many estuarine plants, or just plants that live in estuaries, are halophytes, and that means that they're plants that can tolerate salty conditions. Halophytic plants are adapted to deal with saltwater spray and even saltwater directly on their roots. You can see these trees are really important. These are called mangroves. You can see their roots. They are adapted to have, this is going to be very salty water, and they're adapted to being able to deal with this. Mangroves are really important as they protect the land from erosion from water. And you'll see some halophytes will have filters in their roots that can remove salt from the water. And you'll have animals such as mussels and clams that have developed behavioral adaptations that they use. They expend a lot of energy to function in this really rapidly changing environment. When they're exposed to low salt, they're going to stop feeding. They'll close up their shells and switch from aerobic respiration, in which they use gills, to anaerobic respiration, a process that won't require oxygen. When high tide returns, the salinity and oxygen content of the water increases, and they'll open their shells and begin feeding and return to aerobic respiration. And so just these organisms have to adapt to a really rapidly changing environment, one that's going to change every single day, and sort of like clockwork. And so it's really important for these organisms to be able to adapt to that. Okay, let's get into our freshwater biomes. So we've all talked about so far is the marine or saltwater biomes. Now let's talk about the only freshwater biomes. Freshwater biomes are going to include lakes, like these Great Lakes that I'm showing you an image of, ponds, wetlands, which is just standing water, as well as rivers and streams, which are the flowing water. We really rely on freshwater biomes to provide drinking water, crop irrigation, sanitation, recreation, if you go to the lakes to swim, and even industry like fishing and such like things like that. So these various roles and human benefits are referred to as ecosystem services. So really any time that a human can benefit from a biome, we call that an ecosystem service. Um, Lakes and ponds are found in terrestrial landscapes and are therefore connected with the abiotic and biotic factors influencing these terrestrial biomes. Okay, we'll talk about agricultural runoff as one way that lakes and ponds are affected by what is happening on land. Okay, let's get into that. Let's get into lakes and ponds. Lakes and ponds can range in an area from just a few square meters to thousands of kilometers. Temperature is an important abiotic factor that affects living things found in lakes and ponds, right? During the summer, in the temperate regions, thermal stratification of deep lakes occur when the upper layer of water is warmed by the sun, but that won't mix with the deeper, cooler water. This process produces this sharp gradation or transition between warm water above and cold water beneath. Those two layers are not going to mix until cooling temperatures and maybe winds will break down the stratification, and then the water in the lake will mix from top to bottom. What you find is that cold water sinks and hot water will rise towards the top. Like the ocean, lakes and ponds have a photic layer in which photosynthesis can occur, but depending on how deep they are, they can also have an aphotic layer. Phytoplankton, which are algae and cyanobacteria, are found here, and they provide the base of the food web of lakes and ponds. Zooplankton, such as rotifers, small crustaceans, will consume those phytoplankton, and they're called the primary consumers. At the bottom of lakes and ponds, you'll get bacteria in the aphotic zone that'll break down dead organisms that sink to the bottom and return the nutrients to the rest of the pond. What you'll find is that nitrogen and particularly phosphorus are two important limiting nutrients in lakes and ponds. They're pretty much determining factors in the amount of phytoplankton growth in lakes and ponds. And really, you don't want too much phytoplankton growth in lakes and ponds, or else some really bad things can happen, some really bad cascading effects. Here's an example when there's a large input of nitrogen or phosphorus. This could be from sewage runoff or runoff from fertilized lawns or farmland. What you see is that this growth of algae skyrockets. It results in a large accumulation of algae, and what we call this is an algal bloom. Okay, you might have heard of algal blooms before. Algal blooms can become so extensive that they reduce light penetration in water, maybe to almost nothing. As a result, the lake or pond becomes aphotic completely, and that means all of the photosynthetic plants will die. When the algae die and decompose, or plants die and decompose, severe oxygen depletion of the water occurs because when decomposition occurs, it requires oxygen. If no other oxygen creating organisms live in the pond, you can get a pond that has absolutely no oxygen within it. So that means fishes and other organisms that require oxygen are then more likely to die. So if you ever see a pond that looks like this, that is a big no-no. That's a big example of something that's gone really wrong here. All right, let's get into rivers and the narrower streams. So rivers and streams that might feed into the rivers are continuously moving bodies of water, right? They carry water from some source or headwater to the mouth at a lake or an ocean. The largest rivers include the Nile River in Africa, the Amazon River in South America, and the Mississippi River right here in North America. Um, the abiotic features of rivers and streams will vary along the length of the rivers or stream. So streams begin at one point of origin. We call this the source water. The source water is usually cold, low in nutrients, and really clear. The channel, or basically the width of the river or stream, is going to be narrower here than at any other place along the length of the river. Faster moving water in the short distance from its origin will result in minimal silt levels in headwater streams. Therefore, this water is going to be really clear and moving really fast. That means photosynthesis here is mostly attributed to algae that are growing on rocks, because this swift current really inhibits the growth of phytoplankton and organism and plants that can't hold on. Photosynthesis may be further reduced by tree cover that might be reaching over a narrow stream, and so this shading will also keep temperatures lower. Some other energy input can come from the form of leaves and other organic material that'll fall into a river from trees or plants that border the water. When these leaves decompose, the organic material and nutrients in leaves are returned to the water. The leaves also support a food chain of invertebrates that eat them, right? Little bugs or little crustaceans that might be eating the leaves. That's a big food source for them. Those are in turn eaten by predatory invertebrates and fish. As the river or stream continuously flows away from the source, the width of the channel gradually widens. The current's going to slow down, and the temperature characteristically increases. So here's an example of maybe we're closer to the source where the channel is slow and the water is moving fast. And here's an example of when we're farther away from the source. The channel is much wider and the water current is extremely much slower than it was at the beginning. So now that the water has has slowed down, the silt may settle, and that'll increase deposition of sediment. That means that phytoplankton can also be suspended in this slow-moving water. Therefore, the water will not be as clear as it was near the source. The water is also going to be warmer because it's going to have longer exposure to sunlight, and you can see that there's not going to be nearly as much tree cover here as there is here. So that means we're just getting more direct sunlight into the water. When a river finally reaches the ocean or the large lake that it's running into, the water is going to really be slow at that point, and any silt in the river water will settle. Rivers that might have a high silt content that is going into an ocean that might have minimal currents will build what are called deltas. And a delta is just a low elevation area of sand and mud that happens as the silt from the river settles onto the ocean bottom. But rivers that might have a low silt content, or in areas where maybe ocean currents or wave action are high, will create the estuary areas that we talked about, where the freshwater and saltwater mix. Okay, so let's talk about the last biome, the freshwater biome. These are called wetlands. Wetlands are environments in which the soil is either permanently or periodically saturated with water. Wetlands are different from lakes and ponds because wetlands exhibit a near continuous cover of emergent vegetation. You can see here, emergent vegetation will consist of plants that are rooted in the soil but have portions of leaves, stems, or flowers that extend above the water's surface. Um, there are several types of wetlands that we could talk about. They're called marshes, swamps, bogs, mudflats. Some are called salt marshes. Freshwater marshes and swamps are characterized by like a slow and steady water flow, whereas a bog develops in depressions where the water flow is low or non-existent. And I think that's where I'm going to end it today with when we talk about aquatic biomes. So make sure you take your time to look at the biome lab that is posted, and pick one of the terrestrial or aquatic biomes that we talked about in these first two lectures to become more of an expert on. All right, if there's any questions, feel free to email me. If not, I look forward to seeing your responses to the biomes lab.